joining the conversation, national security expert and USA Today columnist Tom Nichols with a piece out you must read. A wobbly Donald Trump does not strike Iran, and we should be glad. And Bloomberg News White House reporter, my friend Shannon Pettypiece. And rounding out our team, White House reporter for the LA Times, Eli Stokols. Tom, you say these new sanctions against Iran are a way for the president to cover himself. From what?
From an impulsive decision that he tried to back off of once he realized that foreign policy isn't a TV show. I think it's just a kind of a fig leaf now that he says, well, I've pulled back, I've scared them, I've made it clear I'm serious, so now I'm going to put in more sanctions. But there aren't that many more sanctions to put in, and frankly, our allies don't, seem very cooperative about this because he blundered into this without talking to them, without prepping the ground and doing his homework the way one would do before thinking about a military strike like this. And so I think sanctions are kind of just a magic word that says, well, I backed off of this bad decision, and now I have to say something, so I'll say sanctions.
Can you elaborate on that in terms of sanctions? I love how you put it. They're a magic word, but they're a whole lot of nothing if they're not impactful. So what exactly are they, and who will they hurt? Because John Bolton right there said maximum pressure with sanctions. Maximum what?
The problem with this administration is that it uses words without ever defining them, or I think in some cases ever understanding them. I think Bolton fully understands all of this. I think Bolton's been doing this for a long time, and maximum pressure is a phrase the president likes. So he says it. There are things we can do. We can make it harder about Iranian money passing through any kind of American financial institutions. But in the end, part of the reason the Iran deal, and I was not a proponent of the Iran deal, but I was also not a proponent of getting out of it. Part of the problem now is that you have all of the other major players in this deal have decided to stick with it. So if the United States says, let's rally and really tighten sanctions and plug all the holes and make sure there are no gaps, you have the Europeans and the Russians and the Chinese kind of shrugging and saying, this was never our idea, so, good luck, you're on your own.
Shannon, today, like every other day, requires a fact check. The president says he does not need congressional approval if he wants to attack Iran. Is he right?
I'm not a War Powers Act expert, but there certainly is a law in part of our Constitution that requires congressional involvement and congressional approval. Now, if he wants to carry out a sort of isolated, small, targeted attack, that's where you sort of get into the mix and the nuance of these. So, sort of, for example, the response to the use of chemical weapons in Syria, the president took out a very targeted, strategic attack. There were certainly drone attacks carried out by the Obama administration. He did not get congressional approval for everyone. But any sort of broader military engagement, they're certainly going to get a lot of pushback from Congress about their involvement and their need to get approval, which, of course, we saw play out when the George W. Bush went into the second Iraq War.
Eli, I do not expect you to have a crystal ball, but given John Bolton's statement or reiterating that all options remain on the table, what are your sources inside this administration telling you about where this thing's headed?
Well, they don't really know because the president is sort of backing himself into this corner with this bellicose rhetoric about Iran. He's saying that he wants to negotiate, and I'm told that he actually does want to negotiate. It's very clear from the president's behavior. He's not interested in starting an armed conflict. He's told people that he doesn't want to be a president who's held responsible for an unpopular war. So he wants to avoid that. He wants to go with economic warfare, but he doesn't seem to appreciate that the maximum pressure campaign, the economic warfare that he's already doing against Iran, is what is provoking this and pushing them into this position where something is going to happen. Iran shot down that drone because it's frustrated with the U.S. sanctions. It's upset. It does not appear anywhere close to the negotiating table. And for a president who wants to negotiate, he's saying, oh, the door is open. You can have a phenomenal future, Iran. But he's acting and showing to the public here in the U.S. that he's really tough on Iran. He needs to demonstrate that to his base. This has been a talking point throughout the campaign. And so those things are kind of out of alignment. And there's not really certainty within the administration, or perhaps even with Donald Trump himself, about what the ultimate move is going to be here.
Tom, next up for the president, the G20 meeting in Summit. What does the president need to accomplish? This isn't a one-on-one meeting with a world leader, which is more his style. The G20, that's not traditionally his jam.
You know, at this point, I would say the one thing the president needs to accomplish is first do no harm. You know, get through it without a gaffe or a mistake or a promise or a shocking statement that then the entire bureaucracy and foreign policy and national security establishment is going to somehow have to walk back. I think the problem is the president's going into the G20 without a lot of credibility. I think the people that are dealing with him understand that he can change his mind overnight, that anything he says can be reversed by tweet when he's on Air Force One before it even leaves the ground. So I think, you know, at this point, my hope always for every time the president leaves the country is, you know, no major errors or fouls. And I think that's about the best we can hope for.
All right, Shannon, how about a rationale request? Bloomberg, your colleague Jennifer Jacobs has a new piece out saying that the president is considering a withdrawal from a long-standing defense treaty with Japan. Why would that be?
Well, what he's been complaining to his sort of confidence about is that he doesn't feel like this defense treaty is reciprocal. Now, this was something signed 60 years ago after World War II. So we're talking about a much different Japan and a much different United States. But essentially, the treaty says that the U.S. would come to the defense of Japan, but Japan doesn't necessarily have to go to the defense of the U.S., which you can imagine 60 years ago, that might have been a bit much of a request for Japan at that time. But it sort of fits with this pattern of the president feeling like there is this constant unfairness. He uses the word reciprocal repeatedly in all of these trade negotiations and arguments. But he fails to forget, though, that you know, things aren't always going to be reciprocal because the United States isn't on a level playing field with someone. You know, the United States is like the New York Yankees and the New England Patriots, all sort of combined into one. And he fails to realize that our allies aren't in the same position as us.
Well, there'll be a lot to cover in the G20 coming up later this week.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.